This lesson will focus on the strategies that you should employ when taking the 4 FRQs for the AP Environmental Science exam. So you should have a printout in front of you of this document for the 2015 free response questions, and you're going to go ahead and mark all over it. So the first thing we're going to do on the front here in some of the open space is we're going to go over the format of the FRQ section. So for AP Environmental Science, you're going to have 4 FRQs in 90 minutes. And there is no choice. So some AP tests give you 5 and you get to choose 3, but in our test there is no choice, so you have to do them all. So this averages out at about 22.5 minutes per FRQ. So if you take longer on one of them, for example the math question, do make sure that you make up that time somewhere else on a different FRQ. Bring a watch with you into the testing room, a regular watch, not a Google watch, they won't allow that, and then make sure that you are watching the time and that you don't run out of time for the very last question. Some other things to jot down that are important is one of the biggest flaws is that students forget to write complete sentences. And so sometimes an answer will be very short for an identify question, but students forget to put it in a complete sentence, so that's very important. The other biggest fault I see when I grade FRQs nationally is that students are not specific enough, and you want to use precise language. Okay, so what exactly does this mean? Well, let me give you an example that you can jot down of what precise language means. So our example here is that if you just write pollution, for example, if you are talking about fracking and you say fracking causes pollution, pollution is always too vague. That will never get you a point on an AP FRQ, just the word pollution. You need to write the type of pollution. So for fracking, you would want to say it's water pollution. Now, sometimes that will work, but sometimes it's not. This water pollution is iffy, and so what's the best thing to do is to add a word, surface or groundwater. Sometimes they're that picky. So all you have to do is just, instead of saying fracking causes pollution, you say fracking causes groundwater pollution. And so again, just add those precise words, and those are the kinds of things that give you points. You don't have to write a huge amount on an FRQ, but you have to write precise words. What's even better than this one? Well, what's even better than surface or groundwater pollution is to talk about the type of surface or groundwater pollution. So if you can think of one, it's better to throw in something like thermal pollution or nutrient, like nutrient pollution is your phosphates and nitrates, or sediment, depending on what it is. So sediment pollution would be like from dams. Some dams and levees. And then, or maybe even heavy metal pollution, like the pipes in Flint, Michigan. So that was lead. And so let's go over our variations. So pollution will never work. Water pollution works sometimes, so that's iffy. Surface or ground pollution works most of the time, so this is better. And throwing in a specific type of pollution is the best. So whenever you can, throw in extra words. Let me give you another example of this same concept. Go ahead and keep jotting this down. It's really important. So another example is pollution is just too vague again. So if you're talking about the what's one of the problems with burning coal and you write it causes pollution, never going to get a point. So that one's never going to work. If you say causes air pollution, that one's iffy, but it's much better. Sometimes they'll take it, sometimes they won't. But what is best is to throw in one of the air pollutants. And so this one is the best. Always throw in some sort of air pollutant. If you can't remember an air pollutant, your go-to is particulate matter. Particulate matter works for almost every type of air pollutant, whether it's coal or gas or natural gas or oil or even burning wood biomass. They're all going to produce particulate matter. And so if you cannot remember which air pollutant goes with which item, then throw in particulate matter. All right, let's go to the next page. So now you're at the 4 FRQs. So what I want you to do right now, is I want you to read through these questions in 5 minutes. So you're going to pause my video and you're going to set a timer for 5 minutes. And in that 5 minutes, here's what I want you to do. I want you to jot down notes. Oh, you're going to skim them all. Okay, so you're going to just skim through all 4 questions. And you should do this when you get to the AP test. Take 5 minutes. Use your watch for 5 minutes. Skim through them. Jot down notes. Underline some key things. And circling the types of questions like describe, explain, identify. So each question should take you about a minute. The first one will take you longer because it has a little document to read. And then the others should take about a minute each. So go ahead, pause my video, and time yourself for 5 minutes. All right, so now I'm going to go through each individual question. But before we do that, go ahead and you've skimmed through all 4. Now, write down, put a big number on each of them in the order you want to go. So you could go in order of 1, 2, 3, 4. If you like it linearly, that's great. Some kids like to work backwards, and so they want to go 4, 3, 2, 1. That's not a terrible strategy because question 4 is one that usually has a low national average because a lot of kids run out of time and they skip it. And so you could probably earn way more than the national average on that one if you start with that one. But always make sure you have time then for question 1. Or some kids like to go in the order from easiest to hardest. So you've just skimmed them and you have seen that some are easy. You're like, hey, I know this one right away. So you want to get through the easy ones first. Or some want to tackle the hard ones first. Or some want to do the math one, which is number 2 first. So go ahead on your paper, take a minute and put like a big number. So if I'm going to go linearly and I just want to go 1, 2, 3, 4 in order, that's great. So I'm going to put a big 1 here. Or maybe I'm going to go backwards. And so I'm going to put a 4 here. So go ahead and pause the video and do that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about each of them. But let's go ahead first again and go over some of the words. So go ahead and jot these down somewhere. The first word that you need to remember, and there will not be any instructions on this. You have to know this. So identify. If you see identify, and it should be in bold, identify is a short answer. It's more like a vocab word or some short answer without description, but it must have a complete sentence. This is where students have trouble. Identify some words. Some students only write 1 or 2 words and they think they're good and they're not. It must have a complete sentence with a noun and a verb. It can be a short sentence, but it must be complete. The next one is describe. And so if they're asking you to describe, what they're asking for is additional information. And this is not a huge paragraph. It's usually 1 to 2 complex sentences. All right, then going on to the next one. The next one is explain. So explain is usually, not always, but very often, explain is usually some sort of process. So it's usually a process that you have to describe, like the process of eutrophication or how electricity is created, or some sort of steps in order. So when you see the word explain, that's an indication, okay, what kinds of process or steps can I describe? And that can give you some direction. And this will be longer than describe. Usually it's 2 or more points. So a describe is usually 1 point. An explain is usually 2 or 3 points because they want you to talk about multiple steps or multiple parts of a process. And then the last type is discuss. So this one, students don't often get their full credit because they don't remember that a discuss is a 2-part answer. And so sometimes you can say that it's cause and effect, or this leads to that. Something like that. So again, you need to have a 2-part answer for discuss. And those things are really important to remember on this exam. All right, so now let's go ahead and go over question 1. Okay, question 1 is a document-based question, but it's not really. So if you've taken an AP history class or an AP English class, they have often given you a document to read. And in those courses, you're supposed to refer to the document, you're supposed to find answers in the document, you're supposed to quote from the document. That is not the case here. It is not a DBQ. We call it an FRQ. And the document has no answers in it. And so you do not need to quote from it. You do not think that the answer is in there and then you're done. That is a common mistake. It might seem that there's an answer in the document, but the answer is usually too vague and it requires you to come up with something specific out of your brain. Now, you need to read the document because you need to trigger your memory, and there might be hints as to an answer, but there will not be an answer. You need to pull the answers out of your brain and not the document. Here's another common mistake. Look at the word other than. Sometimes students don't read carefully. They actually skip the words other than in their brain, and then they write about the thing that it says not to write about. This happens all the time. So be really careful that you don't write about the thing. So this one says describe 2 human activities other than those that result in anthropogenic climate change that have resulted in a decrease in the amount of fresh water flowing into the Everglades ecosystem. And so some students actually will write about what it says not to write about. So don't do that. So this is a describe, and we have describe here. Explain. So explain, you want to talk about the steps of phosphorus levels, and what they're really asking here is eutrophication. So they're never going to say describe or explain the steps of eutrophication. They will want you to be talking about eutrophication, and they do this about every other year. But they will never word the question and use eutrophication. They will expect you to recognize that phosphorus in water will cause eutrophication, and then they will expect you to then go through the steps of eutrophication. The next item that I want you to see here is that the word economic. So anytime that you are asked about something economic, and it happens every year on FRQs, make sure you mention money or jobs. Don't imply it. Actually write the words. So for example, this one, describe one way that restoring the Everglades is expected to provide economic benefits to Florida. And you write, fishermen can catch more fish. Not good enough. Now in your brain you're thinking, oh, fishermen are obviously people that sell the fish. But that's not true, because there's a lot of people that fish for fun, for recreation. And so you have to specifically say, fishermen can catch more fish and sell them for money. So please actually physically write the word money or write the word job. I want to talk about one more item before we go on. So sometimes my students come back from the AP test and they say, you were wrong, Mrs. Schertz. There was actually an answer in the document. And I say, well, I don't believe you. So 48 hours later, I'm allowed to see the FRQs. And so I go in and I look at the FRQ. And I'll say, I'm sorry, but I was not wrong. So this year, some students thought that this question, BI, actually the answer was found in the document. They said the answer was found for describe how one specific human activity contributes to increased phosphorus levels in the Everglades, and they thought the answer was found here. And it was not. So this was a clue, but the students had to write more precise and detailed information. So they could use this as a clue, but had to pull something out of their brain and not just quote from the document. Actually, I don't think I'm right about the addition part. I haven't looked at the key in a while. And the C was the easiest one. So if you gave up on the math after A or B, then you actually missed points on the easy question. So please attempt all of them. Sometimes it's really, really easy points. And some more information that you need to remember is that in your math FRQs, you must show your setup with units. Units. Students often miss points because they forget the units. And then the answer has to be with units also. Don't forget your units. So please show your setup. Now you can do scratch math off to the side, and that's fine, but you have to show your setups, even if you can do the math in your brain. Like some of you can do C in your brain, but you always have to show your setup in order to get points. Another thing that I want to point out to you is that there is no double jeopardy. And what that means is that if you need the answer to A to solve B, and you get A wrong, but you use that wrong answer in B correctly, then you get points for B. And so even if you get it wrong and it carries on, you can still earn points subsequently. So that is great. Going on to question 3. So sometimes question 3 and question 4 will have some sort of a graph. In 2015, there was a graph on both 3 and 4. Sometimes the graphs are just used for reference, but sometimes you have to do a small calculation. And on this one, you do need to do a small calculation. And this one for 3A, if you take a look, it says determine the maximum volume of oil that is estimated to have been spilled. So basically this is testing, can you read a graph? And so can you look at the deep water horizon section of the graph, and can you determine here what that amount should be? And that was pretty easy points if you could actually just read the graph. There will be some acceptable range. This year, they accepted the range between 185 to 199 millions of gallons. Some of the mistakes that students made that year was that they forgot to put the word million. So if you just put 185 gallons, that is not correct because this is millions of gallons. So be very careful about that. When you answer a question, do not put a range. The range is only for the graders, and if your number falls somewhere between 185 and 199, you're going to get the points. But you have to give a solid number, like 190 million. You can write out the zeros, or you could just write the word gallons. And so again, make sure you write the units, and don't forget millions. It's a common mistake. I'm also going to talk about something else at question 3. Since I had a lot of information from question 1 and 2, I saved this for question 3. And a couple of things that I want to remind you of. On an AP science test, the graders are not concerned about spelling, punctuation, or grammar, or any kind of opening or closing sentences. So these things will actually waste your time. So you do not need any opening or closing sentences. And again, we don't grade them. There are no points in them, and they will only waste your time. Now, this is very different from an AP English test or even an AP History test, where you want to do those strategies. But in an AP Science, it doesn't help you. It doesn't hurt you, but it doesn't help you. Another thing that is really important in an AP Science class is, let's go ahead and look at B, where it says describe 2 environmental problems that can result from oil spills in coastal areas. And the readers of your exam will only grade the first 2. So let's say you write one example here of an environmental problem, and then you wrote another one, and then you thought of, oh, I know an even better one, so you write that one third. The third one doesn't count. So what you should do is go back and look at one of the first 2, and you can cross out one of them, and we won't grade it. So now you've got 2 here that are stronger. And another word with this, another piece of advice is do not keep on writing. In an AP history class, the strategy is to keep writing because in those subjects, they will keep grading and reading to find points the more that you write. But in an AP Science class, that is not true. They will only grade the first 2 examples, and it doesn't matter how much you write, you won't get points, but you can hurt yourself actually. So in this case, you need to be careful because if you accidentally keep on writing and you write a contradiction, they will remove one of your points. So it's actually better for you to stop writing because first, it wastes your time, and secondly, you don't want to accidentally contradict what you wrote and get those points taken away. So be aware of that strategy. So question 4, this one also has a graph. The graph does not have any answers on it, but it helps you understand the question. So for number 4, here's a couple of little pointers as well. Here's a discuss. I actually graded this one nationally. I graded number 4 in 2015 in Cincinnati, and one of the biggest problems was that students were not specific with their health effects. So anytime you're asked about some sort of a health effect, you need to be specific. In this case, discuss 2 human health effects associated with urban sprawl. A lot of kids just wrote stress from driving a lot, or they wrote pollution. Again, even air pollution wasn't acceptable. You'd have to say air pollution causes asthma. Go ahead and name a disease, a specific disease. So stress wasn't good enough. You would have to say heart disease, cardiovascular disease, or diabetes from stress, or something like that. With the air pollution, you would need to say air pollution such as asthma. So asthma is the actual disease. And so they, again, most years they will have a health effects question. So please name a specific disease. Another thing that kids forgot to do was to have a cause and effect. So they said driving more causes disease. So the driving more was the cause. Kind of. A better answer would be people live in the suburbs and have to drive further to work. That's the cause. The effect would be higher rates of obesity. So obesity is actually a disease, so higher rates of obesity would be the effect. So always a 2-part answer for discuss. So that's the end of the 4 questions. Now I'm going to go ahead and switch gears here a little bit, and I want to talk with you about a couple of FRQs from 2016. So go ahead and take a look at these ones. And what I want you to notice on the 2016 one, now this was the number 2, and this happened to be the math question. Now the math question from 2016 was not terribly difficult, so the math parts were number 2 and also, letter A and also letter B. The rest of it was not math. And so, again, to reiterate, you go through and a good strategy is to answer C, and then answer D, and then answer E, and then go back and answer A and B when you're done. But here's what happened with a lot of kids. So they're reading the prompt, and the prompt is talking about pig iron. And students are like, I've never heard of pig iron. This is ridiculous. The question, you actually don't need to know anything about pig iron. And sometimes on the APES test, and I really wish they didn't do this, but they do, but they'll throw out some process or some word that you're unfamiliar with. And students panic and think, I don't know anything about pig iron. I'm not going to be able to answer this question at all. And you actually don't need to know anything about pig iron to answer the question. They first of all explain what pig iron is, and then here are your givens, and here's your math. And the math you can totally do without knowing anything about pig iron. And then the rest of the question was just about mining, your coal mines, and some of the mining issues. So do not be thrown off by pig iron. It is not, was not needed. All right, going on to something else in the next question. Another one I wanted you to look at was the 2016 number 3. And this one had a graph, and on this one you actually had to use the graph to do a calculation, and this is the percent increase. So you would need to do ending number minus starting number divided by starting number, and that's a formula that you need to memorize. And so this one also had a little bit of math, so that's true on occasion. So you'll always have math in your number 2 question. You might have a small piece of math in a different question as well, but that's iffy. It's always a number 2 and sometimes a little one in another. Here's the big thing that I want you to look at for this question. So my students came back last year and they asked me, what are piles of tires? So they're referring to D. Many landfills do not accept used tires. As a result, the tires are often dumped in poorly regulated piles. Describe one human health problem associated with piles of discarded tires. I did not teach this concept in the class in that year for 2016. And this will happen on occasion. Sometimes you will get a question that I never taught or you've never seen before, and in our textbook there was only one sentence about piles of tires. So this kind of became a joke among APES teachers for a while, and that we would post pictures on Facebook of piles of tires because we all thought it was a ridiculous question. And so this happens. So if you see a question like that you have no idea, you've never heard of it before, it's okay, because remember, you are looking for about half the points to pass the AP test. So on each FRQ, you're shooting for half the points. So if you see something completely random like this, don't panic. It's okay. If you've studied well enough, you can still earn a lot of points on the parts that you know. Here's another thing. You can often use common sense on an FRQ. So my students just kind of thought in their heads, and they thought, well, what would a pile of a tire just sitting out there, what kind of problems would it cause? And so a lot of my kids just used their brains and the information they knew, and they wrote about mosquitoes, which was correct. So they would say, well, if it rains, the rain can be captured inside the tire, and it can be a breeding ground for mosquitoes, which carry West Nile virus or malaria or Zika. And that was right too. Another one that students thought of was maybe if they caught on fire, that they would cause air pollution, which would cause respiratory problems such as asthma. So remember, it's a health effect, and you must be specific. Name a disease for a health effect. And so they just would talk about respiratory problems such as asthma. So some of them, even though we hadn't ever learned this, they reasoned it through and were able to get the correct answer.